Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hi everyone, I'm Crystal Contreras and I'm the Director of Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. Welcome to today's program, The Right to Vote at Age 18, Gen Z and the Fight Against Voter Suppression. This conversation is part of our ongoing series of youth talks, presented in collaboration with the Commonwealth Club's new education initiative, Creating Citizens. This program is also generously supported by Levi Strauss & Company. Levi's has a long history of supporting the social issues that define our times, and believes all eligible Americans should have fair and equal access to the polls. Their grant-making supports organizations that are working to reduce obstacles to civic participation and advance voting rights by amplifying youth voices who are building political power and voter engagement among young people. For 50 years, the legal voting age in the United States has been 18 years old. For just as long a time, however, youth voices have faced the challenges of non-participation, shaming, harassment, and suppression. Today's panel of young activists and organizers will touch on these ideas and also the contemporary solutions to these issues. We'll also be exploring Gen Z's impactful activism that is changing democratic engagement in this country. If you'd like to ask any of our speakers a question during this program, you can do so in the chat or comment section of the live stream that you're currently watching. Levi Strauss & Company is proud to sponsor this show and provide a platform for these generational leaders. We at Inforum know that you will leave today's program with the knowledge of how to empower youth in your own communities and the importance of putting the future into the hands of those who will live it. With the full slate of both virtual and live programmings this summer and fall, we ask that you consider donating to the Commonwealth Club to help us continue our work this year and beyond. Please visit us at commonwealthclub.org/online to learn more, and you can also click the donate button you see on the right side of your screen during this program. Now, please join me in welcoming today's incredible speakers to Inforum.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Rainsford Stauffer, freelance writer and author of An Ordinary Age, and I am honored to be your moderator for today's program. Today, we're here in honor of the 50th anniversary of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, and the massive impact youth organizing and social activism has had on American politics and progress. I'm so excited to be in conversation today with an extraordinary panel of experts. Thandiwe Abdullah is an organizer and co-founder of Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard. Alex Edgar is a voting rights activist and incoming freshman at UC Berkeley. And finally, Devansh Kaushik is a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, president of Carnegie Mellon University Graduate Student Assembly, and a member of the Students Learn, Students Vote Advisory Board. Before we begin, just another quick reminder to our audience that if you would like to ask these incredible experts a question, please ask it in the chat or comment section. We will try to get through as many questions as possible toward the end of this program. And with that, I am so excited to get started. To sort of frame the conversation, I'm going to ask each of our panelists a little about the specific initiatives they're involved in and what that work has been like. So Thandiwe, I want to start with you, and I want to ask about your work with Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard and your work to end random searches on the LAUSD campuses. What was that like being a young voice in predominantly older rooms and conversations, and what have the results been like for you?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. But I'm an original member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, which is the first chapter of the Black Lives Matter network. And I was 9 years old when we were founded. And so it was a really interesting experience. It was a lot of like single moms who didn't have, childcare for the children. And so it was me and like a couple other kids, and we cared about the work that was being done. But oftentimes, excuse excuse me, a lot of this work is inaccessible for young people, right? There's a high risk of arrest during some actions, or what if your parent gets arrested, right? My mom's a single mom. And so I was really just looking for a way for young people to be able to organize while addressing these like safety concerns, right? Understanding that we are some of the most vulnerable folks out here. And so when I created Youth Vanguard, and I tried multiple times, it didn't always work. Um, but when I successfully created the Youth Vanguard, it was amazing, right? Like we got to finally address these problems and got to get to work addressing things that were happening in our own community. So the random search policy in LAUSD, which is the second largest school district in the entire nation, was really harmful. And I had experienced random searches since I was in sixth grade. It was really just a violation of privacy, of personal space. It was criminalizing and dehumanizing. And it was embarrassing because all of your peers are seeing you have your things all dumped out on the ground. Your teachers are being interrupted during class time. It was just not a great experience. And so we had been fighting this policy for years. And it wasn't until I think it was 2 years ago when we finally won this policy, but it took years for us to get to where we were, right? We started when I was 13 years old doing this work, and we finally ended, I think, when I was 15. So it took like two and a half years. And it took a lot of work to get that recognition, right? To get our documentary in BET, local elected officials talking about it. But when we finally won, it was just the best feeling in the entire world, knowing that, 13-year-old me and our coalition of like middle school and high schoolers like actually made something so impactful that like stretched out not even just the district, but like throughout the entire nation, right? Getting this publicity and getting this work done, it felt amazing.
Absolutely incredible. I'm so excited to ask follow-up questions on that. And with that, Devansh, will you tell us about your work with Students Learn, Students Vote, and what kind of direct impact you've seen through that work?
Yeah, thanks for having me and thanks for the question. So I guess I got involved with SLSV like 2 years ago when we first had the Western Pennsylvania Student Voting Summit in Pittsburgh. And since then, I think SLSV has provided amazing resources to students across campuses to organize, recruit volunteers, register students to vote, get out the vote, recruit students to be poll workers. Like last year itself, we recruited 50 students from CMU who served as poll workers in Pennsylvania 17th. Even though CMU itself is in Pennsylvania 18th, part of Pennsylvania 17th is in Allegheny County. And Pennsylvania 17th is a very competitive district. It's currently represented by Congressman Conor Lamb, but it's a very, very competitive district. When he first won his election, it was by a few hundred votes. It ran multiple hours into the night. So the idea behind that has been to empower students, empower staff at universities, like empower every stakeholder in the process to get as many students involved as possible in the in our democratic process. So that's been my work over there. And yeah, like other than that, I think mostly my work is in the advocacy space, particularly higher ed advocacy, science policy, and immigration policy. And I'm happy to chat all about that.
Awesome. We're going to get there. Alex, round us off here. I know you also did incredible work last year to get young people turning out in 2020. Can you explain to the audience what you did in Ventura County?
Of course, and thank you so much, Rainsford, for introducing and having us here. So I've lived my entire life in Simi Valley, California, which tends to have a history of being a fairly racist Republican town. It was the home of the Rodney King trial. It's kind of known as Copland because of the number of LAPD officers who live here. So it's a very suburban bubble white flight place. So politics and especially more progressive policies have always kind of been outside of the norm here. And me and a good friend of mine, Sana Niazi, we both have been very passionate about voter registration and getting young people involved in the civic process in any way possible. And throughout high school, we tried doing voter registration drives, and we're very lucky to have support from the school and different community groups. But with COVID, we decided that we wanted to really step it up, especially with the 2020 election being as important as it was. So we created a whole voter registration week. So we created 5 different events and publicized them to Simi Valley students at all of the local high schools, but also to any other community members. And we had community groups from GLAD LA and the League of Women Voters and the Civic Center, to even more local ones like 805 Resistance and Rise Simi Valley, and really just put together a week full of informational events focused on marginalized communities and really focused on how voting is such an important part of who they are and why you really need to think beyond yourself when it comes to voting and think about how to make this place we call home a better place. And it really turned out, it was an amazing show of support from the whole community, and seeing how we were able to get students from all over and different community members and city council people all to come together to really just focus on getting youth engaged. It was a really powerful feeling.
Incredible. And thank you all so much again for making time out of your work and out of your days to be with us. Reminder to our audience to drop those questions into the chat or Q&A box. I'm so excited to ask you all more specific questions about your work, but first, to kind of frame the conversation, I'm going to ask a couple general ones to the group. So Thandiwe, I'm going to start with you, and I'd love to hear what an assumption people might hold about young voters that is false, and maybe one that's true.
I would say, I would say an assumption that's false is that young voters are influenced by their parents or are influenced by other authority figures when it comes to voting. I think it was actually very clear, especially during this recent election, that young voters are often influencing other people, right? Young voters were influencing their parents, were influencing their teachers and their community elders and leaders. It's so interesting, whenever I hear there's people who want to lower the voting age still, and I think that's a conversation that is really important. But whenever I hear that conversation come up, there's always someone who's like, oh, well, young people, it shouldn't go any lower because then your parents will control how you vote. And I simply just don't think that's true. Yeah. And then one thing that I do think is true is that young people don't find hope in voting. And I think it's true to a certain extent, right? I think especially Gen Z and the generations to come are more imaginative when it comes to true transformative change, right? I think we have a understanding that voting is a tool of change, but it is not all that you need to be doing. And so when people say that young people aren't motivated to vote or don't see the point in voting, it's not really true. It's just I think we see beyond voting, right? What does direct action have to do with change, true transformative change? What does door knocking, canvassing, showing up at your elected officials' offices, disrupting? I think we see a lot of other different paths to change other than voting.
I love that. Devansh, do you want to go next and tell us an assumption that's false, an assumption that's true about young voters?
Sure. I think I hold a slightly different view from that. One thing that I think is definitely false, which I agree with Thandiwe on, is that, there's an assumption that young voters are generally apathetic. They don't really care about things, but I don't think that's true. I think they care about things. They want to have their voices heard. I think, you know, we've seen how young voters can be persistent on a lot of issues. And from personal experience, I tell you, like people who have not been engaged in any advocacy work before, when you give them the platform, they pounce on it. Like they take it and they make the most out of it. You know, and like I've seen that here in Pittsburgh. I've seen that on other campuses. And I think that's one assumption that's definitely false. One assumption that's true, I think for sure, persistence, that young voters or young activists are, they persist even under failure. I wouldn't say that they don't have, much hopes with regards to voting. I think I've seen like a lot of different people. It's not uniform, but I've seen a lot of people who look forward to that day, look forward to casting their vote, look forward to, getting rid of someone or bringing someone in. Right? We organized this town hall at Carnegie Mellon, and it was full of students. We organized a primary debate for Pennsylvania governor in 2018 on Carnegie Mellon campus, and it was full of students. Now, I think students are generally very enthusiastic about the political process. They are just, they need the right platforms in some cases, which they are being deprived of by some powerful factions.
Such great points. And Alex, do you want to finish us off for this one?
Yeah, I'd say one that I think is false is that young people are really just influenced by social media, by whatever is really popular in the world when it comes to their voting. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've heard from adults, once you're in the real world, you'll see, your views will change once you've actually lived life. And I really think that's just a huge misconception that so many people have, because with access to social media and access to the internet, we are more informed as Gen Z is more informed about the issues that we're passionate about than really pretty much any other generation, because we have every fact, everything at our fingertips. We hear about the issues as they're happening. So I think that's definitely a misconception that we just are influenced by the events, when in reality, it's that we just are so much more informed about what's going on, which is why we were able to form such strong beliefs about things. And then one thing I'd say is kind of true is that that Gen Z tends to be less enthusiastic about voting. And I think kind of as Thandiwe was saying is that people don't always connect specifically with voting, but they do connect with wanting to see the change. Whether it's feeling like neither party really represents them, because that's something I know a lot of people, just neither party is having candidates that really fit their views, fit the type of people that they want in elected offices, or it's that they just don't think the democratic process is working in the way it should, and think that, as Thandiwe was saying also, the direct action is the way to go, because that is the way to truly change people's minds. So that I think is a big kind of true conception.
We're looking forward to diving into all of this and more over the course of our panel. And to our panelists, if you'd like to respond to something a fellow panelist says, please feel free to be in conversation with each other, as well as with me and with our audience watching. Thandiwe, I want to go back to you and bring up some things that you discussed in your initial answer, talking about being very young and protesting, safety concerns, parents getting arrested, parents on the front lines. And it made me think about this idea of young people participating, which is the talking point we hear a lot. How are we going to get young people to participate, to engage? I want to ask you whether you think there's a difference between that participation element and young people leading, and where we should be falling on the idea of young people not just participating and engaging, but in leadership roles.
Yeah, that's such a great question. One thing that I'll say is that yes, I love the idea of young people in leadership, but I also kind of want to push back on the idea that, every young person needs to be a leader. I love the conversation that we're beginning to have like as a society, right? Where like young people are being shut out of like government jobs, political jobs, like just positions that were usually being held by like older people. But when it comes to like organizing spaces, right, and being on the front lines, young people don't need to be leaders all the time, right? I think it's really important that participation aspect comes before leadership. We saw a lot with the protests. What was that, last summer? Wow, time is really flying. With the protests last summer, there were a lot of young people leading protests who didn't know what they were doing. And it's not that, young people aren't capable of knowing what they're doing, but it's important that you have the experience and that you take the wisdom from our elders and from past movements, right? People who have done this before. We have access to, my grandma was a part of the civil rights movement, right? My grandfather was a part of the student athletes protest at Berkeley. And so these are resources, these are tools for us to become even better leaders when it is time for us to take these positions. And so I do think that the young people who were exposed to being on the front lines, the children of those like single mothers, I do think that we make great leaders and that we can help empower other young people to become leaders as well. But just making sure that like, you don't need to be a leader right away. Like it's important that we get that education aspect before we jump into these roles, right? So that we can truly like embody all of the qualities that is needed of us.
I think that that's such an incredible and important point. And I want to stay on it for a minute before we move on. I want to open it up to all of you who might have thoughts on this, because what you described so perfectly about this idea of not having to be a leader right away, about being able to learn from elders. I want to ask what you all think about a term I hear a lot, especially in the media, especially about politics, this idea of the generation wars. Is that a thing we should even be focusing on in terms of the political divide, getting young people to turn out, or is this something that's overblown?
I'd love to jump in and answer this one. Give Tendiwe a break from having to go first. I really think like, even if you're on TikTok, social media, there's always like oh, this generation's beefing with this, the okay boomer, right? It's a constant kind of like joking going around. But I really think the idea of a generation war, it is kind of just an overblown statement, because I feel there's definitely a strong like difference in how the generations vote, and then there's a difference in how the generations feel on issues. It's each generation we see there's more and more progressive views, more and more kind of beliefs that are changing, and that's usually how it goes as times go on. The general beliefs of the country change, but I think it's less that there's a kind of fight between the generations, but more that there's just a difference in ideas, and it's really hard to change someone's viewpoints when they've had them for the past 60 years of their life. And I think that definitely causes problems when you have young people who want to be taking on the next step. They want to be really leading and pushing forward in whatever it's the workforce, with politics, whatever it may be, and kind of being combated with people who want things to stay at the status quo because that's what's worked for them. And really trying to find a way to, break down that barrier and really push through to try to make more spaces for Gen Z, millennials, the younger generations to kind of be more involved in all aspects of life.
Right. Someone once asked me this question, and we didn't really have a really good answer at the time. But when we were talking afterwards, we were traveling, and this just came up that, well, who were the last two people standing in the Democratic primaries? Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. They're from the same generation. They have different ideas. Where is the generation war? I think the whole idea of quote unquote generation war is like distracting from the real issues of who's getting impacted and who's not, because more often than not, the impacts of bad policies span generations. And it's, how to define a generation is another thing, but they often do. For some people, I might be from an older generation now. That I was just at the bank today, and I was like, "Well, do you open a new student account?" And they were like, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 25." "Well, sorry, sir, we only open college accounts for 18 to 24 years old." So that happened. I'm now a part of older generation, I presumably will be impacted the same way that Anive or Alex will be impacted by various policies. So I just think that the focus should be on how a policy impacts people, rather than, oh, is it favoring one section of the society that's 65 years or older? So maybe we should have another policy that favors people who are 18 years or younger. I don't think that's the thing.
Is it okay if I say like something else really quick?
Of course.
Divyansh brought up like such a good point when you were talking about like the last two people standing in the Democratic primaries, right? Like Biden and Bernie, right? And I think that when we're talking about these like generation wars, it's so important that we like bring up that these generalizations of these generations, it's harmful, right? Like we assume, or like we have a belief that folks who are like the boomers are so conservative and unwilling to change and unwilling to do work because they're overrepresented in politics and in the media, and like, the people who have those beliefs, right? Sorry, they are overrepresented in these spaces of power. But like that generation also has folks from the Black Power movement, right? Bernie Sanders is like a social democrat and Biden did the like crime bill. So there's people who are varying different political beliefs in every generation. And when we're talking about like the generation wars, it can become a problem, like touching back to what I said before, but it can become a problem because like we have folks who are like living resources, like living history, who we need to be talking to, who are part of these different generations. And because like they're like people who have so maybe narrow-minded, maybe like, not wanting to change type of beliefs in politics and in like, places of power, we don't believe that we can like, I don't know, I guess like talk to these living records of history and folks who can like really empower us to do good work. And so, yeah, sorry for talking too much.
No, this is fantastic. Reminder to our audience members, drop your questions into the Q&A and chat. Divyansh, I want to stay with you and I want to talk about your advocacy work on specific issues, because one of the things I've heard about a lot is that young people are more likely to get behind a specific issue rather than necessarily any single politician or even political party. So how can we bring young people to the ballot box by focusing on the issues themselves?
That's an amazing question that like hits so close to home. One of the things that we started at Carnegie Mellon in particular was, so all these organizations, they reach out to various candidates who are running for office. They ask them, hey, well, where do you stand on this particular issue? League of Women Voters creates its own questionnaire. Planned Parenthood creates its own questionnaire. The Conservation Coalition creates its own questionnaire. Some conservative organizations create their own. So you look at those and you see that none of those are actually touching upon, issues that students might be facing, even though like students are an increasingly large block of voters. And when they do touch on those issues, they're very like focused or very generalized issues like, okay, well, what about my student loans? And when you talk about that, that becomes a very national issue. Students are like, I'm gonna go with whoever's like, whoever is going to get rid of $60,000 that I owe right now. And that's, they're not thinking that, I'm going to support Biden or I'm going to support Bernie. They're like, is this person going to, reduce my debt or not? That's the issue they care about. So what we started doing at the state and local level, reaching out to candidates with questions specific to student needs, like at the city level, reaching out to all candidates running for city council, county council, mayor, about landlord tenant issues, because that apparently is the biggest thing when students are renting apartments because of the power dynamic. Minimum occupancy limits, things like food insecurity. When you look at Carnegie Mellon, it seems like, okay, well, it's such a big school. It's, the tuition is so high and stuff. People should be able to afford it, which is why they might be going there. But 20% of CMU students face moderate to severe levels of food insecurity. Students get behind that thing. So regardless of who is running, if there's someone who's catering to their need, they want to know about that. So we sent out these questionnaires to everyone who was running for city council, county council, state legislature, governor, etc., and asked what they thought about these issues, then followed up a year later. And students were so excited to share the kinds of issues they wanted to bring up. Then we started partnering with local media outlets as well to raise some issues. Like we recently had a student loan series in a local nonprofit media outlet. We had another media outlet cover international students in Pittsburgh, what they were going through. And since I was mentioning this, like last year when the Trump administration decided to deport all international students who would not take classes in person, domestic students reached out to me that they wanted to register people to vote because how passionate they were to support their fellow students who could not vote because they were behind that issue. Like they were not compelled to register to vote because they wanted to get rid of someone or bring someone in. That they thought they were doing by being registered themselves. But they wanted to register other people so that they could tell other people what impact it is having on them and their friends. So I think, yes, students get behind issues more than they get behind politicians. I personally engage in a lot of nonpartisan advocacy on the Hill. I have worked with Republicans and Democrats. If there's a hardcore conservative Republican who wants to, bring a pathway to citizenship for DACA students, I would work with them. I don't care where they come from, what their political background is. It's just the way of getting things done, I think.
Amazing. And relatedly, Alex, I want to hear about how you registered students to vote, which we know you did virtually last year. And so I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with our audience about how we make the voter registration process itself more accessible to younger voters.
Yeah, so this is something I think is super big and important step that we as a country need to take, because voting and voter registration, it's more of like a chore to do. It's something that you have to work for rather than what it should be. It should be something that everyone is a part of, that everyone is just automatically doing. I know in Sweden, they have automatic voter registration for all of their citizens. And their voting rate is so much higher because it's no longer having this obstacle in your way. Voting is a right. We want, everyone says we want everyone voting. We want, American citizens to be involved with the process. But by having this obstacle of having to sign yourself up, it just creates an unnecessary step. And we've seen with voter ID laws and other restrictions, especially in the wake of the 2020 election, with all of these laws passed in states, that people aren't trying to make it easier to vote. And that is something that hurts minority voters, hurts disenfranchised different communities. but it also really hurts young voters, especially when you have a voter who's off in college and they have to vote in their hometown, their home state. When you have to go through all of these steps to get your voting, get to do the absentee and do all these hoops, every November they're going to probably be at school. So if they're not locally near at home, you're having an entire group of students, an entire group of the voting population who just don't have the same access, the same ability as someone who's, working in a job and they're 50 years old and can easily have an absentee ballot shipped to their house or easily go to their local polling station because they have the time, they have the ability. So I really think the For the People Act is truly what right now, like the biggest, most important piece of legislation when it comes to voting, because just everything included there, from just modernizing the voter registration process with automatic voter registration, the same day and online voter registration, kind of making those systems better. Because I know when we did it online, it's a whole process of having to walk people through, you have to check off this box and make sure you write the party preference or no party preference, and then having to validate with a signature or with your ID, which is something that's online is a little bit harder to do. They have to send you the thing to sign and submit back. So really making voting more accessible is really the best way to get more people to vote, because like we were saying, especially Gen Z is really passionate about issues. They're really passionate about being involved and really making a difference. But these laws, these different rules that are set in place just make it so much more challenging than necessary. Like we saw that there wasn't some widespread fraud with the election. There wasn't widespread problems with it. But there were people who were unable to vote and unable to do it because of things put in place to stop it. So it's about taking down these unnecessary barricades and really opening up the process so that young people, so disenfranchised, different communities really can re-engage with the civic process.
Amazing. We've only got a few minutes left before our audience Q&A, but I want to see if I can get in two more questions to our incredible panelists here. According to recent reporting, White House officials and allies of President Joe Biden have expressed to voting rights groups that they can out-organize voter suppression. And so to this panel, I want to ask what you feel the unique challenges are to young people voting. What are the barriers keeping them out? And what do we need to do to lower those barriers and bring them in? Thandiwe, do you want to take us away on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not able to vote yet. In a couple months, I will be. But I just remember last November, was that last November? Sorry, time since the pandemic is just so crazy to me. During the last election, I kept seeing things on the news about how college students weren't able to vote because their polling places shut down. There's only 2 polling stations on their campus. People were lined up at 9 p.m. Right. So there's that. But then also taking in the different racial demographics and socioeconomic status. I know folks in my own community who didn't vote simply because they would have to travel for miles to find a polling place. And there's one polling place in my area in South LA where people come from all different. South LA is big. LA as a city is really big, but people are coming from all over South LA to this one polling place, and it's a small polling place. And there's not a lot of time that young folks have. You got to work, you got to pay off those student loans. And so I think it's also I easily get frustrated. I know a lot of other young people do. I'm not going to wait in line for hours and hours and hours just to vote when I know that my vote might potentially not even mean anything, right? So it's I think there's just a lot of frustration about all of the different barriers, like Alex was saying, when it comes to not only registering, but actually when it comes time to do it. It's okay, am I really going to do all this when I could be, at work right now, or when I could be at school or doing something that seems more important at the time? So yeah.
Devansh, do you want to chime in here on where this voter suppression comes from and what we should do about it?
I have a very long response to this. So Alex, if you want to go first, please feel free to. Otherwise, yeah.
So go ahead.
Okay. Well, so I think young people have on college campuses and in communities, like they have been doing extraordinary work to lead movements of democratic participation. And their work, yes, it is helping transform our democracy for the better. But when considering this, particularly going back to the comment that reportedly was made by a White House aide, so when you're considering voter suppression or the 26th Amendment as well, right? It's important to think not of it in a vacuum as something of and by for young voters only. It is like one in a long line of rights expansions for various Americans who were excluded from the democratic process at the country's onset. The amendment came about during the civil rights and the anti-war movements and after the women's suffrage movements of the early 20th century. So, throughout the country's history, there have been various powerful factions, as I was mentioning earlier, like who have been working to establish a second class of citizenry. At first, it was everyone except land-owning white men. Then it was women and minorities, and then only minorities. The target keeps shifting. You cannot out-organize that. But the intention is always the same, that power for some and disenfranchisement for others. So when you think of the 26th Amendment, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of, it's not just a legal document, it's a promise. So many of the legal and psychological barriers to youth suffrage that existed before the 26th Amendment still exist. They existed right after the 26th Amendment as well. And so do many new ones. So fulfilling that promise requires constant work, not just from organizing perspective, but from policymaking perspective. You think of it, the 14th Amendment was passed, and the idea was that we're going to provide equal protection to everyone. But that wasn't enough. They had to bring in the 15th Amendment to provide voting rights to Black people, then the 19th Amendment to provide voting rights to women, 26th Amendment to provide voting rights to everyone above the age of 18. Like, it's not something you can out-organize. It has to be attacked from a policy-making perspective. So like that's my response to whoever came up with that line.
I'd have to agree with what both of them just said, but also to kind of add on something that hasn't been mentioned so far, but I think is really important, is just the way that the current voting process in the Electoral College causes so much voter disenfranchisement. Because you take a look at, Gen Z, right? The most Gen Z voters are college students, and college towns, depending on, where in the country, what school they are, tend to lean heavily one way or the other. They're either, a very democratic place, as most, a majority of colleges tend to be, or it's a very Republican place. And when you have something like the Electoral College that really says when we're voting, when all this, like, it's not every vote matters as much. It's more, if you live in a state that is red and is going to go red, what's the point of voting? Like, you from the offset that your vote may show some support, that maybe there's some tides changing in your state, but if you know the outcome of the election, why would you skip work to go vote? Why would you stop studying for your upcoming final or something when ultimately it doesn't matter? And I mean, even if you are part of the majority in a state, like, I live in California, California pretty much is always going to vote blue. So if you're a college student, if you're, first out of college, starting your new job, like, if you're a Democrat and your CA district, is going to be fine. Like, I'm going to Berkeley. Barbara Lee won with 90% of the vote. Like, she was doing fine there. Like, if your vote isn't going to really change anything, it's such a problem with actually getting people to want to do it, to actually want to go out of their way to vote if they feel like it doesn't matter in the first place. So I know I'm a big proponent that the Electoral College is a very antiquated system that just causes further disenfranchisement. But definitely agreeing with what everyone was saying, that just organizing when the policies just don't work for the people. We tend to always go to this very traditionalist view of this is what was written, this is what the law says, when the law was written 100 plus years ago, and the laws don't represent the society we live in today, yet we're judging our lives based off of these people who aren't alive anymore. And I really think trying to work around the laws when we should, as the people, have the power to change the laws to make a better system for ourselves is kind of a ridiculous notion.
So I'd add something there. I think there's a huge emphasis in the younger voting generation, and I'm saying younger as if I'm old, but no, sorry, I'm not. But that the presidential election is the most important election. It is important. It is probably the most important as well, yes. But there are equally as important elections happening in your local jurisdictions where the electoral college isn't at play. Last election cycle, we saw a lot of progressive DAs being elected who are working to decriminalize their jurisdictions. We saw a lot of progressive mayors being elected. We saw a lot of amazing people who do not have the traditional political background being elected at the local and state level, who can influence so much change. Like if someone says that their vote doesn't matter, or they think their vote doesn't matter, I'll tell you, there's a neighborhood right next to Pittsburgh, neighborhood of Braddock, right, or township. The former mayor is the current lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. He won his first election as the mayor of Braddock by 1 vote. He's the current lieutenant governor. He's running for the Democratic nomination to the US Senate. And, the point about that is you have to cast your vote. I agree, there are incredible obstacles, but I just think there are too many important elections down ballot that go unnoticed, or people think that they're not super important. The other thing I wanted to say, to the part about out organizing, there's a pretty good example just from the last election cycle. Texas, Missouri, Alaska, I think, were 3 states who implemented laws which said that we're going to automatically mail absentee ballots to anyone over 60 or 65 of age. And so youth voting rights activists were like, well, that violates the 26th Amendment, because the 26th Amendment not just guarantees the right to vote to anyone above the age of 18, but it also says it shall not be a barrage, or you shall not put any obstacles to that. And so that was essentially age discrimination in voting, because Missouri had this thing that if you're a student and you want to vote in Missouri, then you got to request an absentee with excuse, and you have to have your ballot notarized. Good luck finding a notary, first of all. But people filed challenges to those in courts. A Texas court granted an injunction to the Texas policy that, yeah, it does violate the 26th Amendment. The Fifth Circuit granted a stay on that injunction, and the Supreme Court denied hearing the case altogether. So basically, that policy went into effect. So while it may seem that the laws were out there to make it easier for people to vote, they were actually there to make it harder for people to vote. And the effect was seen throughout, because a lot of students could not vote home because of these policies. And so you can't out-organize that. And whoever has the idea that you can out-organize that, I like to grab a cup of coffee.
This is incredible. We only have a couple minutes before we transition to audience Q&A, but I want to end on a forward-looking question. It's intentionally broad because there are a lot of answers to this one, from lowering the voting age to broadening how we think about civic education and civic engagement in general. But I want to ask our panelists, what changes you would make right now, not to just make voting more accessible to younger people, but to pull them into the political and social processes and policies that impact their day-to-day lives. Thandiwe, do you want to take it away?
I always get stuck with the hard questions first. I don't know. I mean, okay. Well, I definitely think that I definitely would want to lower the voting age more, especially for local elections. I think that people in high school should be able to vote in local elections, period. But I also think that we need to do better when it comes to like voter education, the history of voting, right? We don't like, it's so weird to me. I was not taught that in high school. Like I didn't know any of that. I had to learn on my own. And also like when we're talking about the history of this stuff, we need to come at it from like a wide variety of different angles, right? So like, okay, if we want to talk about how women got the right to vote, okay, well, how was that influenced by the abolitionist struggle, right? Like, how was that influenced by Black folks? How did it sell out Black folks? Like, how did, when Black folks finally got all our full rights to vote, how did it empower other people of color? And so like all of these different conversations are so important because it not only empowers us to vote, but it empowers us to do other things as well, right? So like those direct actions that we were talking about, showing up to your elected officials' offices and pressuring them, having all of this like, yeah, having all the historical context and seeing things from like a wider scope, I think would help us carry on this like radical tradition of like putting policy into place and changing things.
I think that was an incredible answer. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I have to agree with Thandiwe like 100%. I recently did some work with a group called the Educating for American Democracy Initiative. And what they're working on right now, and it's a whole nationwide effort, it is really just to get civics and civic education to be involved K through 12. Because I 100% agree. I did not like have an interaction in school really about civics until my AP Gov class. Like that in my opinion should not be the first time you really are introduced to voting and what it means to be a civic engaged person, what it means to be a citizen. Like this is a conversation we should be having our whole lives. Like we are all American citizens. Like voting is something that everyone will have access to eventually. Like it is always going to be there at 18. So I think it is so important to start introducing to even young kids who maybe don't have the full understanding of what it means to vote, and really starting to work them towards, this is what it means and this is why it's so important. Because if we're introducing these concepts before they're 17, before they're 18, and that's like literally the next thing they're doing and like it's being thrown at them, if we start introducing this way earlier, it creates an idea that it's more of a normal thing, that it's something that everyone should be doing, and that we kind of would be able to make it more commonplace for especially younger people to just be involved and to really understand what's going on, rather than the way I feel it is now, is that you have people like Thandiwe who are, creating their own movements, creating their activism and getting involved with organizations. But that's outside of school. That's outside of the place that we're all going. We're all getting an education, but it's really about making that education fit for us as citizens, not just learners.
Okay, that's a tough act to follow, but I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think there are a couple additional points that I'd add. One thing is how the universities see their obligation under the Higher Education Act. Currently the universities have to work technically they have to work to register students, make sure students have the correct information about elections, etc. If they want to receive federal funding. But how most universities actually go about that is they consider it just checking a box, right? They need to be taking their commitments more seriously. The directives need to be coming from top down, not handed to one staff member who's like, who reports to 7 people between them and the president of the university, right? So that's one thing that the universities could do. But the other thing that one thing that I would like to emphasize that Alex has mentioned about civics education, how many people know, what US was, what the idea behind America was. Like, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances that the founders had with King George was that he was not allowing people to naturalize as American citizens. And you look at people today, they're actively fighting to make sure that people cannot naturalize, right? Like, so, when the US, for instance, when it first implemented naturalization law in 1790, it was among the most open the world had ever seen. And the founders had never intended the US to be a nation defined by its borders, closed to outsiders. So America was to them an idea that outsiders could opt into and make their own and become a part of. And that's something like, for instance, New York is taking steps in, like that is a direction that New York is taking steps in right now. Maryland, presumably, the presumed mayor, Eric Adams, has endorsed a council, a bill in the city council that would allow non-citizens to vote in state and local elections. And DC is trying to do the same thing. So when you look at these things, you have to look at it from a very holistic perspective. I think the 14th and the 19th Amendments explicitly expanded the notion of, voting rights to many Americans. And so when the 14th, 15th, and 19th, so when we talk about the 26th Amendment, what we are really talking about is fulfilling that vision of America as expressed by its founders and the founding documents. So, there's this thing in the Ask Every Student program that SLSB has, which incorporates one-on-one conversations about voting into college and university processes that touch on every student. So, bringing students, like having kind of their get-go into the citizenry, like, yes, what do you need to know? What are you missing out on in terms of your civic education or things like that? So I think not just involving students in the civic participation or telling them about what the nation's history is with regards to voting or other aspects. I think it's important to think of it in a broader, holistic viewpoint, as Thandiwe mentioned. How has the history evolved around this situation? Like, ironically, Georgia is ground zero for voter suppression today. But in 1943, Georgia was the first state to lower voting age to 18 for state and local elections. So, we need to think of it from a very holistic viewpoint, how this is related to the power dynamics that some people want to establish a second class of citizenry, and how do we need to attack that? And I remember this quote that, well, not the exact quote, but when Bobby Kennedy went to University of Kentucky, he said, if you're not producing radicals, then you're not doing your job. That's not exactly what he said, but that's the gist of it. So universities need to take more initiative.
This is incredible. We have so many interesting audience questions here, which I think is a testament to the brilliance of our panelists. I want to start by asking one that is directed to all of you as a group. So whoever has strong feelings, go first, and we'll hear from everybody. The question is, how did you start seeing yourself as leaders in this space? Did you ever struggle with imposter syndrome?
I can go. I still don't see myself as a leader, though. I think one thing is that that's something that Thandiwe mentioned earlier, that not everybody has to be a leader, right? But at the same time, I view this slightly differently. Everybody who's participating is a leader in the process. It takes a lot of commitment to be there to participate. If you are participating in civic action, you are a leader to your peers, to your family, to your friends who will see you and get inspired. So I don't think there's anything over here to feel imposter syndrome. Like I'm sitting in this room with two amazing voting rights activists who've presumably done more work than I've ever done. And I am not feeling imposter syndrome. So, just take my cue. Try something. If you fail, you fail. Otherwise, you get to sit on such amazing panels.
I'd say for me, I think when it comes to just getting involved with anything when it comes to politics, is that it's not just like a race to the top. Like the whole goal of being involved in the political process, it isn't really for personal gain. And if that's what it is for anyone, to kind of take a step back and rethink your reasons for it. Like in reality, we're all on our own path. We're all taking our own steps to reach whatever goals we have for what we want to see from our community, from our state, from our country. And it's easy to look at other people, whether they're your age or older, and say, I want to be that, or why am I not there yet? When rather just like take a step back, look at yourself, and realize that you're at whatever step on your path to becoming the best activist, the best citizen that you can be, and really just focusing on trying to be the best for yourself and not the best in comparison to others.
I think I still struggle with imposter syndrome, especially, it was a big culture shock for me, like even going from my elementary school to like my high school, and like going from all Black space to like a predominantly white space. I remember after I finished my senior year, I was like, I don't even know what my own voice sounds like anymore. And spending that year at home, I finally got to like hear myself, and I was like, wow, this is what I sound like, right? Because I'm so used to code switching. And in the advocacy space too, I noticed that a lot, right? Doing gun violence prevention work with March for Our Lives. That space is not a space full of people who look like me, right? Doing voting stuff, right? There's not a lot of people who look like me, who sound like me. And so usually there have been a lot of times when I didn't show up as my most authentic self. And it took me a long time to realize like showing up as your authentic self is what drives change, and is what really like shifts things, right? People aren't used to hearing different perspectives. And so if you are constantly shifting who you are to suit the energy of the space, it's not doing anything. You're playing a part in this like status quo, right? But we're trying to shift that. So coming to terms with that and really just telling myself like, I deserve to be here and I deserve to be who I am in this space. And if people aren't comfortable with that, then it's not my problem. I keep having to like say that over and over in my head as like a mantra, but it's working so far. So yeah.
Amazing. And we have another audience question here for all of our panelists. It reads, how can we change the stigma of youth voters being unknowledgeable when in actuality they can be just as knowledgeable and further bring a new, fresh view to electoral politics? Alex, it looks like you've got thoughts. Do you want to jump in there?
I feel like that's a really tough one because it's really asking how can we change a large group of people's minds about something that they just don't want to see. Because I think, as I mentioned before, when we were talking about like a misconception or one that was true, is that older generations who don't have the same understanding of social media, the same understanding of the internet, like Gen Z, we grew up with the internet. Like we've had that for pretty much our whole lives. So it's a very different dynamic that we have with like online spaces compared to older generations, even millennials. Just there's a definite difference in how we interact with it. So I think it's really hard to convince them that, we aren't just copies of the influencers we see online. We're not just copies of, the environment we're in, that, we really are using these opportunities, using these resources to better ourselves and to better our understanding of things. I know even just online, like seeing people talk about wanting to read theory and trying to figure out, how can I not just understand the current state of things, but understand what really happened that got us to this place and why are things the way they are. And I think it's not really something that can easily be said as like, this is a way of showing everyone that young people are smart, they are educated, and they deserve their spot, at the table, as more just by more and more Gen Z and other generations getting involved and really just showing rather than telling, I think is the really only way it'll work.
I think if I had to give a one-line answer to this, I would say it was a 32-year-old Thomas Jefferson who stood up and said, all men are created equal, in a company of old people, right? Well, no offense to old people, but it take people doubted him, right? But persisted. You do the work rather than, optimizing a second order objective of convincing someone. I think that's where I come from. I think you are one of many. It's there's the danger of futility that a lot of people come up with, that okay, maybe I'll fail, but once you get over that, and not to spam people with too many Bobby Kennedy quotes, but when he went to University of Cape Town, I think 1960s sometime, he said one thing, that thousands of Peace Corps volunteers are making a difference in isolated villages and city slums of dozens of countries. Thousands of unknown men and women in Europe resisted the occupations of Nazis. So it is from numberless diverse acts of courage that the belief that human history is thus shaped. Right? And each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lives of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from million different centers of energy, and bearing those ripples, they build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. So, regardless of whether you feel like you've convinced someone or not, once you stand up for that ideal, along with the thousands of others who are standing up with you, or who will eventually stand up with you, that will take down the walls that you're standing up against. So I come from that perspective, that I do not really think that I want to optimize the second order objective. I think people are more convinced by the work than anything else.
And what was the question again? It was about young people being uneducated or something.
Yes, it was how we change the stigma of youth voters being unknowledgeable when in reality they bring a new, fresh view to electoral politics.
Okay. I think, well, first and foremost, we have to shift the conversation about knowledge, right? I think what a piece of the conversation that hasn't really been talked about as much is there's a lot of, I don't want to say classism, but intellectual elitism that happens in these spaces, right? And, when we're talking about young people not being knowledgeable, and having fresh perspectives, you can still have the fresh perspectives, right, without knowing all the fancy words that are what it all means, right? And so, I mean, maybe I'm just imposing my own personal experiences onto this question, but it was really frustrating to me leaving my community and my community advocacy work and moving into larger national spaces where I didn't know what some of these words meant. I didn't know what, excuse my language, I didn't know what the hell these people were talking about. And I was like, what are you saying? And it was so confusing and frustrating for me to feel almost looked down on for not knowing what was going on. But once I knew what was going on, I had so much to say and I had such great ideas to contribute. And so yeah, I do think that there are young people who aren't traditionally knowledgeable. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the fresh perspectives. And if I think like, if you want to have the traditionally knowledgeable young people, there needs to be more work done to make sure that we're educating all young people, right? From young poor folks, young undocumented folks, people who have been incarcerated, right? Like making sure that all of these people have equal access to political education. And they all have the fresh perspectives. They just don't all have that education. So that's my take.
I think that is an incredible place to end our audience Q&A. Thank you to our audience members for all of your tremendous questions. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. I wish I could be in conversation with these panelists for another 2 hours. But before we officially wrap, it is our tradition here to ask all of our speakers the following question. What is your 60-second idea to change the world? So please share yours, and we will start with Thandiwe.
Oh, I would just say, okay, I'm very inspired by all of the mutual aid that we've been seeing recently, especially since the pandemic. And so I just want to see a world where everyone's work and advocacy comes from a place of empathy. When we all have this view of like being in community with each other. I see all of y'all as like an extension of myself, and I want the best for you. Whether that means I give you food if you're hungry, I'll give you a ride to school if you don't have a ride. Like I just want to see a world where we can all just like truly care for each other and show up for each other in whatever ways we need each other to.
Incredible. Alex?
I'd say I love Jawandi's idea, but since we've been talking about voting all of this panel, I'd say kind of my big thing would be kind of ending the two-party system, because I feel like you have these two parties that are like the umbrella, right? You have everyone fitting inside them, when in reality, we see like all over the world, there's other systems that work that are still able to accurately represent people, and laws are still able to be passed without needing to cram everyone into two separate spaces. Otherwise, they don't really have a voice. So I definitely think, there's no easy solution with that in our current system, but finding a way to really allow everyone to have their different opinions and still be able to have a voice and a vote is a really important step we need to take.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Agreed with everything that's been said. I'll once again take a step back and look at it from like a broader perspective. I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest barriers to youth voting is that young people are new to the democratic process and they kind of lack a proper orientation into our electoral system. So that idea is the basis for Ask Every Student program, which incorporates like one-on-one conversations about voting into college and university processes that touch every student. So when we think about like making a difference in the world, Ask Every Student is an amazing concept, but what if we thought bigger? Like as I mentioned earlier, founders didn't believe that borders should define our country. So we shouldn't let borders define our citizenship. Like if we want to truly empower the next generation to address problems like climate change and economic inequality, we need to indoctrinate them as global citizens, not just as Americans. So that's my 60-second idea. Other than please let me graduate.
Thank you so incredibly much to Thandiwe Abdullah, Alex Edgar, and Devansh Kaushik for joining me today at Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. We'd also like to thank Levi Strauss & Company for generously supporting this program. If you'd like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Rainsford Stauffer. Thank you so much to our brilliant panelists and to our audience members watching, and we hope everyone stays safe.